September 1945. Tokyo is a landscape defined by the absence of color, a skeletal remains of a city where the very air tastes of charred cedar and oxidized iron. The silence that hangs over the district of Kyobashi is heavy, broken only by the rhythmic crunch of broken roof tiles under the feet of those who dare to move. Here, the sun does not set so much as it sinks into a gray haze of lingering dust. For the women huddled in the darkness of improvised shelters, the twilight brings a familiar, cold dread. They have been told for years that the end would come not with a whimper, but with the arrival of monsters, the blue-eyed devils, who would sweep across the islands to exact a terrible vengeance for the years of war. The historical context of this moment is one of absolute psychological exhaustion. Japan had spent the last decade in a state of total mobilization, a spiritual and physical hardening that had stripped the civilian population of everything but the will to endure. By the time the surrender was signed aboard the USS Missouri, the Japanese capital was a graveyard of over 250,000 buildings. The women, who had been the backbone of the home front, were now the guardians of a defeated culture. They moved through the ruins like shadows, their skin sallow from a diet of sawdust-adulterated flour and sweet potato vines. They expected the Americans to arrive with the bayonet and the torch, mirroring the grim propaganda that had characterized the Westerners as predatory beasts devoid of human mercy. In the basement of a partially collapsed warehouse, 3 women sat in a darkness so thick it felt like a physical weight. They had cropped their hair and smeared soot on their faces, a desperate attempt to make themselves invisible to the conquerors. Every rumble of a distant truck engine sent a collective shiver through the group. They remembered the radio broadcasts. The Americans would destroy the Japanese soul. They would hunger for blood. The emotional contrast was stark. On one side, a nation conditioned to believe in a glorious, suicidal end. On the other, the terrifying uncertainty of a life under the boots of an enemy they did not understand. They waited for the sound of breaking glass or the harsh bark of a foreign command. Instead, they heard the low, steady hum of heavy machinery and the strange, rhythmic clinking of metal on metal. The Americans were not merely arriving. They were unfolding into the city with an efficiency that felt alien. Factual records from the first weeks of the occupation describe a military force that moved with a baffling sense of calm. As the women watched through a crack in the floorboards, they saw the first silhouettes of the GIs. They were impossibly large, their uniforms made of thick, unpatched wool, their movements casual and confident. They did not look like the starving, desperate predators the propaganda had promised. They looked like men who belonged to a world where hunger was a forgotten memory. In the deepening shadows of the first night of the occupation, the women of Tokyo gripped their bamboo spears, unaware that the first contact would not be a strike of steel, but a flicker of light that would challenge everything they believed about the enemy. By the second week of September 1945, the arrival of the Americans was no longer a rumor whispered in the soot. It was a physical weight descending upon the streets of Tokyo. From the ruins emerged the giants, as the local women began to call them. These American GIs stood in stark, almost grotesque contrast to the Japanese populace. While the average Japanese male had shrunk under the calories of war to a gaunt frame of barely 5 feet, the Americans arrived as specimens of a different reality. They were broad-shouldered, their faces flushed with the health of a nation that had never known a blockade. As they dismounted from their olive-drab Studebaker trucks, their boots, made of thick, supple leather rather than the canvas and wood of the Japanese, struck the pavement with a sound of absolute authority. The historical evidence of this encounter is found in the stunned silence of the civilian crowds. The Japanese women, who had been mobilized into neighborhood associations to prepare for a final, suicidal defense with sharpened bamboo spears, stood frozen as the supply columns rolled in. They watched as crates were pried open with crowbars, revealing a mountain of material that defied the logic of the previous 4 years. There were stacks of sea rations, massive tins of coffee, and heavy wool blankets, all stamped with the U.S. insignia. To the Japanese observer, who had been taught that the Americans were a soft, decadent people. The sight of this organized, industrial abundance was a psychological blow more powerful than any artillery shell. The emotional contrast was jarring. The Japanese had expected a vengeful, ragged horde. Instead, they found soldiers who appeared almost bored by their own wealth. A GI would lean against a truck, casually unwrapping a chocolate bar, a luxury that had not been seen in Tokyo for years, and toss the wrapper into the ash without a second thought. This casual disposal of wealth was incomprehensible to the Japanese women, who had spent the war meticulously unraveling old sweaters to reuse the yarn. The American soldier didn't just carry a weapon, he carried the output of 1,000 humming factories. Symbolically, the American truck itself became a rolling icon of democracy's surplus. It was always full, always running, and always accompanied by the smell of high-octane gasoline, a scent that had become a memory in Japan. The transformation began in the eyes of the observers. They saw that these men did not look like the demons of the posters. They looked like the masters of a world where resources were infinite. As the soldiers began to unload crates of non-military supplies near the temporary barracks in the Ginza district, the women noticed a specific type of small, heavy box. They did not yet know what was inside, but the way the soldiers handled them, not as precious ammunition, but as common utility, suggested that even in the midst of ruin, the Americans had brought with them the power to push back the dark. The giants had arrived, and they had brought more than just the terms of surrender. They had brought the weight of an empire that could afford to be generous. The moment of contact occurred near the skeleton of what had once been the Shimbashi station. A group of Japanese women, led by a former schoolteacher named Haney, had been tasked with clearing debris from a nearby alleyway. When a massive American transport truck groaned to a halt nearby, the women instinctively huddled together, lowering their gaze to the dust. They expected the harsh bark of orders or the rough handling they had been conditioned to fear. Instead, they heard the heavy thud of a tailgate dropping and the sound of soldiers whistling, a casual, melodic sound that seemed blasphemous in the middle of a graveyard. A young American corporal, his sleeves rolled up to reveal muscular forearms, hopped down from the vehicle. He did not reach for his sidearm. Instead, he reached into an open crate and pulled out several thick, white cylinders. The historical reality of this encounter was defined by a profound linguistic and cultural chasm. Without a word of Japanese, the soldier approached the group. Haney felt her heart hammer against her ribs, her breath catching as the giant loomed over her. He extended his hand, palm up. Resting in his calloused grip were 3 pristine paraffin candles. They were not the crude, yellowish tallow sticks the Japanese had struggled to produce during the final years of the war. These were smooth, heavy, and brilliantly white. For a long, agonizing moment, the women remained frozen. They searched the soldier's face for the cruelty they had been promised by the radio broadcasts, but they found only a tired, almost apologetic kindness. When Haney finally reached out, her fingers trembling, the wax felt cool and substantial, a physical piece of another world. The sensory shock of the gift was immediate and overwhelming. To a population that had lived for years in a state of enforced darkness, where every scrap of fat was diverted to the military and blackout was a permanent condition, the candle was more than a utility. It was a miracle. It was a symbolic object of American abundance. While the Japanese military had demanded that civilians sacrifice their very light for the emperor, the Americans were giving it away as a gesture of casual greeting. The women looked at the candles, then at each other, their faces smeared with soot but their eyes wide with a new, confusing realization. The corporal simply nodded, touched the brim of his cap, and climbed back into his truck, leaving behind a scent of tobacco and diesel. This was the transformation of the enemy into something far more complex. The historical records of the early occupation often highlight these small, unscripted acts of generosity that did more to dismantle the devil myth than any official proclamation. As the truck pulled away, The women did not return to their spears or their fear. They stood in the gray light of a dying afternoon, clutching the white wax. The soldier had not asked for their submission. He had given them the means to see. In the palm of Haney's hand, the smooth paraffin represented a democracy so wealthy it could afford to provide light to its conquered foes. The encounter was brief, but the psychological impact was permanent. The darkness of the war had been absolute, but in the ruins of Shimbashi, the first crack in that darkness had been made not by a bomb, but by the weight of a gift they never expected to receive. To understand the shock of the American candle, one must first grasp the absolute logic of scarcity that had governed Japanese life since the late 1930s. By 1945, the Japanese Empire had been hollowed out by the demands of a total war ideology that viewed civilian comfort as a betrayal of the front lines. The state had effectively weaponized poverty, demanding that the population survive on the spiritual strength of the Yamato race rather than material goods. Light, something as fundamental as the sun, had been systematically stripped away. Every gram of fat, every drop of oil, and every scrap of tallow was requisitioned for the war machine. In the final years, even the traditional warasaku, Japanese candles made from the sumac tree, had vanished from the markets, redirected to military hospitals or used as industrial lubricant. Historical evidence from the home front paints a picture of a nation submerged in an artificial, state-mandated gloom. The blackout was not merely a defense against B-29 raids. It was a psychological condition. To light a fire or a candle without a specific, state-sanctioned purpose was seen as a lack of patriotism. This forced scarcity created a reality where a single candle was no longer a household item, but a precious, hoarded treasure. The Japanese women had been conditioned to believe that the world was running out of everything, that the entire planet was engaged in a desperate, starving struggle for the last remaining scraps of resource. They lived in a world of substitutes: pine root oil for fuel, acorn flour for bread, and the cold, unyielding dark for their nights. The emotional contrast between the Japanese expectation and the American reality was rooted in this deprivation. The propaganda had insisted that Americans were wasteful and weak, yet when the women saw the GIs, they saw a force that possessed a surplus of everything Japan had sacrificed. The Americans didn't just have better weapons, they had a better normal. The soldiers possessed a casual relationship with objects that the Japanese considered sacredly rare. To a woman who had spent the war years boiling citrus peels to make a crude lamp oil that barely flickered, the sight of an American soldier using a high-quality candle merely to find a lost button in a crate was a staggering revelation of power. The candle became a symbolic object representing the sheer, terrifying abundance of democracy. In Japan, light was a privilege granted by the emperor. In the hands of the Americans, it was a utility so common it could be given away to strangers. This abundance was the greatest weapon of the occupation. It suggested that the American system did not require its people to suffer in the dark to achieve victory. As the women carried their gifts back to their families, the logic of scarcity began to crumble. They realized that the war had not been a contest of spirits, but a collision between a nation of less and a nation of too much. The paraffin candle, white and heavy, was the first proof that the darkness of the last decade was not a natural law, but a failure of the ideology they had been forced to serve. The sensory transition from the traditional Japanese tallow to the American paraffin candle was, for the women of Tokyo, a chemical revelation of their nation's defeat. The warasaku, the traditional candle of the Japanese islands, was a product of intense, manual labor, derived from the crushed berries of the sumac tree or the rendered fats of fish and livestock. It was a temperamental object, prone to sputtering, producing a thick, acrid smoke that stung the eyes and left a layer of greasy soot on the low ceilings of the shanties. Its flame was a deep, reddish-orange, a flicking ghost that seemed to struggle for survival in the damp air of the ruins. To use a traditional candle was to be reminded of the Earth's limits and the toil required to extract even a single hour of visibility from a world of scarcity. In contrast, the American candle was a marvel of industrial chemistry and petroleum-based abundance. As the women brought these gifts into their cramped living quarters, the first thing they noticed was the scent. It did not smell of animal fat or scorched vegetation. It had the clean, neutral scent of high-grade paraffin, a byproduct of the massive American oil industry that had fueled the Allied victory. This smell was, in itself, a historical marker. It spoke of a logistics chain that stretched from the oil fields of Texas to the refineries of the Pacific coast, and finally to the holds of Liberty ships. The paraffin candle was a symbolic object of a society that had conquered the problem of production. While Japan had been forced to recycle the same scraps of fat until they were rancid, the Americans possessed a substance so pure and plentiful that it appeared like carved marble. The emotional reflection triggered by this contrast was profound. When the women finally struck their precious matches, themselves a rare commodity, to light the American wick, the result was a steady, brilliant white light that didn't flicker or groan. It burned with a terrifying consistency. In the small, windowless rooms constructed of scorched corrugated iron, the radiance of a single American candle was enough to illuminate corners that had been lost to the shadows for years. The women looked at their own hands, seeing the dirt under their fingernails and the hollows of their cheeks with a clarity that the old tallow lamps could never provide. The light was too much. It was a surplus of illumination that felt almost decadent in a land of rubble. This was the smell of abundance. It was the realization that the Americans were not just wealthy in terms of gold or territory, but wealthy in the very elements of life. They had so much energy and so much oil that they could solidify it into white sticks and give it away to those they had just finished bombing. For the Japanese women, the paraffin candle became a silent witness to the disparity between their lived experience and the reality of the Western world. To light an American candle was to accept a piece of American democracy into one's home, a system that prioritized the individual's ability to see in the dark. The scent of the burning wax replaced the smell of char and death, serving as a fragrant, steady promise that the era of starvation and darkness was being superseded by an era of industrial light. The physical presence of the American candle acted as a silent, glowing rebuttal to the years of documented imperial propaganda that had saturated the Japanese psyche. Since the late 1930s, the Japanese Ministry of Education and various media organs had cultivated a specific image of the Western enemy, the Kichikubei, or the devilish Americans and British. The propaganda depicted Americans as a race of hedonistic savages who thrived on the suffering of others, characterized by a lack of spiritual depth and a penchant for mindless destruction. Women had been told in radio plays and newspaper illustrations that the arrival of these men would mean the systematic looting of their homes and the physical desecration of their families. They had been trained to view every American gesture as a trap, every smile as a sneer of conquest. Historical evidence of the internal conflict caused by these gifts is found in the diaries of survivors who struggled to reconcile their education with their reality. When a woman returned to her shanty with a candle gifted by a soldier, she was carrying a piece of evidence that contradicted the state's narrative. The propaganda had insisted that Americans were cruel and resource-hungry, yet here was a soldier who had reached into a mountain of supplies to offer a stranger the means to see in the dark. The emotional contrast was destabilizing. If the Americans were the demons they were taught to hate, why were they not taking the few remaining scraps of Japanese food? Why were they providing a luxury that the Japanese government had claimed no longer existed on the planet? This realization triggered a profound transformation in ideology. The Japanese spiritual mobilization had been built on the idea that the West was morally bankrupt and physically weak. However, the candle, a symbolic object of American abundance, suggested a different truth. It proved that the American system was not only physically superior in its ability to produce, but also possessed a level of stability that allowed its soldiers to act with unforced kindness. The propaganda had relied on the logic of scarcity to foster hatred, convincing the people that the world was a zero-sum game of survival. The American candle proved that the world was not a place of inevitable starvation, but a place where a surplus of democracy could lead to a surplus of light. As the women sat in their shelters, watching the steady flame of the paraffin, they were participating in an act of quiet rebellion against their former masters. They were seeing the enemy, for the first time without the lens of the state's distortion. The white wax was a physical manifestation of a truth that the imperial government could no longer suppress. The Americans had arrived not to extinguish the Japanese people, but to replace the flickering, soot-heavy tallow of the past with a new, steady radiance. By shattering the propaganda through a simple act of giving, the occupation forces began the process of deconstructing the wartime identity of Japan. The candle was not just a gift. It was a light that exposed the lies of the past decade, forcing a nation to confront the reality that their devils were merely men from a land of unimaginable plenty. In the cramped, lightless shantytowns of the Ueno and Kyobashi districts, the lighting of the first American candles became a collective ritual of psychological transition. As night descended over the ruins, the usual impenetrable wall of blackness was punctured by small, steady points of white light. For the women who had spent years in the blackout, the simple act of striking a match to a gift from the enemy was an act of profound emotional vulnerability. They gathered in circles within their makeshift dwellings, structures often built from rusted metal and scorched wood, and watched as the paraffin took hold. The ritual was silent, almost holy. The transformation was not merely physical. It was an atmospheric shift that turned a place of hiding back into a place of living. The historical evidence of this change is found in the way the communal spaces of the ruins began to soften. Under the old tallow lamps or the flickering pine root oil, the shadows had been long, jagged, and threatening, hiding the scars of the city. But the American candle burned with a high, clear flame that reached the corners of the room. It revealed the faces of children who had forgotten what it was like to see their mothers clearly after sunset. The emotional contrast was striking. Where there had been the cold, isolating dread of the devils in the dark, there was now a warm, shared curiosity. Neighbors who had previously stayed huddled in their own fear began to peer out, drawn by the unusual radiance emanating from a nearby shack. The light acted as a silent invitation, pulling people out of their individual shells of survival. Symbolically, the candle served as a beacon of American democracy's primary promise, the restoration of the individual's dignity through the provision of basic needs. While the Japanese state had demanded that its citizens become invisible to survive, the American gift made them visible again. The light allowed for the resumption of small human tasks that had been abandoned, mending a sleeve, reading a scrap of an old newspaper, or simply looking into a neighbor's eyes. This was the new radiance of the occupation. It was a physical manifestation of the shift from a war footing to a peace footing. The atmosphere of the community changed from one of hushed, terrified waiting to one of tentative, illuminated conversation. This transformation was the first step in the ideological reconstruction of the nation. As the women shared the light of a single candle to stretch its life, they were also sharing a new understanding of their occupiers. They noticed that the light didn't just illuminate their poverty. It illuminated the possibility of an end to it. The candle was a recurring symbolic object of abundance that stood in defiance of the rubble. It suggested that the future would not be a continuation of the gray, starved past, but something bright and defined. In the glow of the paraffin, the blue-eyed devils were being recast as the architects of a new world. The ritual of the candle lighting became a nightly reminder that the darkness of the imperial era was being pushed back, one small, steady flame at a time, by the unexpected generosity of the victors. The factual reflection of the occupation is rooted in a logistical reality that was, to the Japanese observer, indistinguishable from magic. The ability of a single American corporal to hand out high-quality candles as a casual gesture of goodwill was the result of a supply chain that represented the peak of 20th-century industrial power. Historical data reveals the staggering scale of this operation. By late 1945, the port of Yokohama was processing thousands of tons of cargo daily, a significant portion of which was non-essential comfort items intended for both soldiers and the stabilization of the civilian populace. This was the price of democracy, a calculated investment in the idea that abundance could be a more effective tool of pacification than the sword. While the Japanese Empire had been forced to cannibalize its own infrastructure just to keep its front lines supplied, the American military arrived with a surplus that allowed for an entirely different philosophy of occupation. The documented records of the Quartermaster Corps show that the American supply system was built on the principle of over-provisioning. Every GI was a walking warehouse of American productivity. To provide a Japanese woman with a paraffin candle did not deprive an American soldier of his light. The system was so vast that such a gift was statistically invisible. This was the ultimate symbolic object of American democracy, a system so efficient that it could absorb the cost of kindness without weakening its own foundation. The emotional contrast for the Japanese women lay in the realization of their own government's failure. They had been told that sacrifice was the only path to victory, yet they were now being fed and lit by the very people who had achieved victory through the opposite method, the mobilization of limitless resource. The American candle was a physical manifestation of a society that did not view the civilian as a burden to be stripped, but as a consumer to be supplied. This historical evidence suggested that the American victory was not just a military triumph, but a triumph of a superior economic and social model. The Americans didn't just have more candles, they had a system that made candles common. This abundance was the silent engine of the transformation. It shifted the perception of the Americans from devils to providers. The women began to understand that the Americans were not there to take the little they had left, because the Americans already had everything. The price of democracy was the cost of showing a conquered people that a different life was possible, a life where light was a right, not a sacrifice. As the trucks continued to roll and the crates continued to open, the Japanese people were forced to confront a truth more powerful than any weapon, that the strength of their new neighbors was rooted in a prosperity so deep it could afford to be shared with those who had once sought to destroy it. The shift in perception was not a sudden explosion of friendship, but a slow, rhythmic dissolution of the barrier between the conqueror and the conquered. In the ruins of Tokyo, the paraffin candle transitioned from a puzzling gift to a bridge, a tool for communication that bypassed the limitations of language. As the women became accustomed to the presence of the American GIs, the historical records show a shift in the geography of the city. The dark, impenetrable alleys where women once hid became spaces of tentative exchange. A woman would step into the light of her doorway, holding a piece of origami or a small wood carving, waiting for the rumble of the supply trucks. In return, the soldiers, often sons of farmers from the American Midwest, would reach into their pockets for another candle, a stick of gum, or a chocolate bar. This was the birth of a new social contract, one forged in the steady glow of the white wax. The emotional contrast of this period was defined by the melting of the devil myth into the reality of a neighbor. The American soldier, once a faceless monster of the radio broadcasts, was revealed to be an individual with a home, a family, and a bafflingly consistent sense of humor. The Japanese women began to observe the GIs with a meticulous, scholarly intensity. They noticed how the soldiers handled their abundance, not with the grasping greed the propaganda had predicted, but with a casual, almost careless ease. To the Japanese, who had lived under a regime that measured every grain of rice, this ease was the most attractive feature of the occupation. It suggested a life without the constant pressure of survival. The candle became a symbolic object of this ease. It was a light that didn't have to be earned through suffering, but was simply there, provided by a democracy that valued the comfort of the living over the glory of the dead. Historically, This era marked the first tentative exchanges of culture and gratitude that would define the post-war alliance. The women began to offer small services in exchange for the light, mending the heavy wool uniforms of the GIs or teaching them basic Japanese phrases. These interactions, centered around the necessity of the candle, dismantled the ideological wall that the war had built. The transformation was profound. The woman who had smeared soot on her face to hide from the devils was now using the light of an American candle to carefully sew a button onto a soldier's jacket. The enemy had been humanized through the medium of material abundance. This was the bridge from enemies to neighbors. The candle served as a silent negotiator, proving that the Americans did not require the Japanese to be broken, only to be peaceful. The symbolic weight of the gift grew with every night it burned. It was no longer just a way to see in the dark. It was a signal that the two nations were no longer operating on the logic of total war. In the flickering light of the shantytowns, a new Japan was being born, one that looked toward the American surplus not with fear, but with a desire to understand the system that produced it. The era of the blue-eyed devil was over, replaced by a complex, illuminated partnership that began with a single stick of wax. The light of the American paraffin candle, once a jarring anomaly in the scorched districts of Tokyo, eventually became the eternal flame of a new era. By the time the occupation transitioned into a sovereign partnership, the symbolic object of the candle had completed its historical mission. It had acted as a catalyst for a transformation that was both psychological and ideological. The poetic reflection of this moment reveals a larger truth about the nature of freedom and abundance. The Japanese women who had once crouched in the shadows of the imperial total war now stood in the steady, unapologetic light of a democratic future. They had discovered that the blue-eyed devils were the harbingers of a world where human needs were not a secondary concern to state glory, but the very foundation of a stable society. The historical legacy of the gift of light is found in the rapid reconstruction of the Japanese soul. The candle had illuminated the path from a culture of enforced scarcity and state-mandated fear to a culture of industrial prosperity and individual agency. The emotional contrast between the charcoal-stained darkness of 1945 and the neon-lit vitality of the subsequent decades is one of the most profound shifts in modern history. The candle was the first physical proof that the old world of the sword had been superseded by a world of the machine and the ballot. It was a representation of American abundance that did not conquer through destruction, but through the overwhelming weight of its surplus. To give away light was to prove that one system was inexhaustible. This abundance served as a recurring symbol of a democracy that thrived on the elevation of the common person. The Japanese women, who had been the primary witnesses to this material and moral revelation, became the architects of a modern Japan that would eventually produce its own abundance. The paraffin candle was the spark that ignited the engine of change, proving that a society built on the principles of freedom could provide a normalcy that was more powerful than any weapon. The transformation was total. The nation that had lived in the soot was now looking toward a horizon defined by the same steady, white radiance they had first seen in the palms of their conquerors. The epilogue of this historical narrative is a meditation on the permanence of that first contact. The candle eventually burned down, its white wax consumed, but the truth it exposed remained. It revealed that the darkness of ideology can be pierced by a single, quiet act of generosity. The eternal flame of the occupation was not a fire that burned cities, but a light that allowed a defeated people to see their own potential. In the end, the American gift was not just a utility for the night. It was the signal that the long winter of the human spirit had ended. The memory of the candle persists as a testament to a larger truth, that the ultimate victory of a democracy is not found in the surrender of its enemies, but in its ability to offer them the light of a new and abundant life.